Welcome, freedom-loving people. It's great to be back today with another episode of the Restricted Handling Podcast. My partner in crime, Ryan, is currently in Europe, where he's doing some work, and he's logging on early in the morning to make this podcast happen. I'm in Washington, D.C., which is a rare occasion for me. And today we have a very important guest. It's going to talk about a really important issue, which many people don't fully understand in my assessment. But we have Mr. Roman Steblivskyi, who is the Senior Director for Policy and Advocacy at the Economic Security Council of Ukraine, which is a non-governmental organization. It's not a Ukrainian government organization. It's independent of the government of Ukraine or any other government. And I met Roman and some of his colleagues recently in Kiev at a conference, and by the way, and Odessa. I learned that they specialize in analyzing and understanding sanctions policy. And so when I met such fascinating people, I said, hey, I want to invite you on our podcast to maybe talk to our audience, our followers, about sanctions. I'm going to assume we're going to focus on Russian sanctions. We may veer off and talk about sanctions on Iran, Venezuela, other countries, North Korea. I think the focus will be Russian sanctions. Roman, Vitayu, welcome. Ryan, good day, mate. I don't know. What do I say to you, wherever you are?
I think that's Australian.
Yeah,
I feel like that was an Aussie accent, man.
I love the Australians, man. I love the Australians. All right.
We just beat them in the World Cup, though. But no,
I guess it's
great,
top of the
great
morning
see
to you, little boy. Yes.
Sure.
Okay. Roman.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
Roman, as I said before we got started here recording, this is one podcast I've been incredibly excited to be a part of. We reference sanctions quite a bit in our discussions, and then we have a daily intel feed that goes out. It talks about sanctions almost every day. Every couple weeks, we do a deep dive on the economic situation in Russia. Sanctions always come up, but I feel like I don't quite understand the impact and effects of some of those sanctions. So I was really excited when Glenn proposed this, and thank you for the time. I think the first thing, just as you noted, that the ESCU is not a Ukrainian government organization. Could you just give a little more context on what that organization does, what your role is, as we set the table here, getting started?
Yeah, sure. Again, thank you for the invitation. It is a great opportunity to speak to you and to your audience. The Economic Security Council of Ukraine is a non-governmental independent organization which was started in 2021 with the idea to look into corrosive capital of Russians into Ukraine and to analyze which sectors the Russian money came into and which impact it had. Because Russian invasion of Ukraine started in 2014, and the hybrid aggression actually never ended, I guess. Yeah, that's why the first goal of the organization before the full-scale invasion was to work with Russian money in Ukraine, but in 2022, after the full-scale invasion of Russia, the team focused mostly on sanctions. The specific focus of the organization are the supply chains. Yeah, so we are focused on the analysis of the supply chains, which of the components are going to Russia, where Russia take its resources which is not available inside the country, and which economic instruments can be used in order to stop the supplies. We work a lot, of course, with the Ukrainian government. We are pretty incorporated into the sanction structure of Ukraine because we need the stakeholders who actually make the decisions. We also work with the EU institutions, with member states, with UK, and US track was also very active, I think, before 2025. In that part, ESU also had an advocacy trip to US, had a lot of meetings with all of this the stakeholders, so that work was also pretty much big and had a lot of impact, which we will talk around later.
Roman, we hear a lot about the effects of sanctions. I was just wondering, some people think of them as symbolic, but we are seeing some effects, it appears, in Russia. And you mentioned the US, EU, UK. There are so many different avenues for sanctions. Could you just talk about some of the effects that you might be seeing today or people might see coming up, whether it's on the battlefield or in Moscow for Russia?
Yeah, sure. We talked a lot about the difference between a symbolic role of sanctions, and the the effect which sanctions have. Because actually we can say that the nature of sanctions is usually pretty symbolic. Politicians use sanctions a lot to react to some activities and to show that the country is strong and the reaction of country is strong towards some actions of other countries. So I think that it is the nature of sanctions that they are like always symbolic, and always have this function to provide the reaction. But if the sanctions are always symbolic and just symbolic, then they lose their threat, and the politicians lose their weight, actually, to show that they are important and the country is strong. That's why, at least sometimes, sanctions must be effective in order to show the specific effect of the decision. And the story of sanctions against Russia actually provides us a lot of the cases, both symbolic and effective. When we're talking about supply chains, from my perspective, the sanctions against dual-use goods and military goods are 100% effective because Russians are not able to buy any dual-use goods or military goods from Europe, like directly, for example. So it is impossible to have the contract between a Russian company and a European or US manufacturer because it is a criminal responsibility, it is evasion of sanctions, and this trade is done. Of course, we are talking about sanctions evasion then, and the way how to counter sanctions evasion. From my perspective, the sanctions evasion topic is the next topic, when we're talking about effectiveness, because it is a common sense that if the sanctions can be evaded, then we are talking about effectiveness. And here, of course, we should then describe like the specific supply chains and the specific instruments which government can use in order to monitor those supply chains. Even though, if you're talking about the task of sanctions to make the supplies longer and more expensive, even sanctions evasion make them sometimes effective if the goal is to make them longer and more expensive. In our work, we have a bunch of examples. For example, when the EU banned the export of chromium to Russia, some European shareholders in Kazakhstan were afraid of the EU sanctions, stopped the supplies from Kazakhstan to Russia, and we got that in the media. Russian media published that a number of Russian plants actually stopped for a while because they were not ready for such sanctions and for the alternative supply chains. That was an example of an impact of one supply chain, on a dozen of the plants. When we scale this to all the sanctions which were imposed, and which were enforced, then this one example which could be traced multiplicates to the scale of the whole economy, which is depending on the alternative supply chain.
So, Roman, very interesting point here. As you said, if I understand it correctly, even though the Russians may be able to evade sanctions, it costs them more to buy any product that is sanctioned or any commodity because they have to go through a whole nother network, recreate. And I've heard, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but often they have to pay double the price that they would pay usually. Let's say if you're going to buy a lathe that they need to produce weapons, that if they're buying it through a number of cutouts instead of being able to buy it directly from the manufacturer in Europe or in the US or in Japan, name the country, that they actually have to pay double the price at a minimum to find that cutout and sustain that cutout. Is that correct? What are the numbers that you have? Because I think it's important because people say sanctions don't work. They're getting this stuff anyway. But the point is that it's breaking the Russian state budget. The more pressure you...
I would say here, sometimes, it is not just only about the price of the product, because sometimes for making such a supply, you need to make a new company, for example, or establish a network of companies which will make this supply. And each of these companies would need to have the money for their operations, for salaries of the managers who are going to find those items, buy them, and risk for being sanctioned by, for example, US, as a secondary sanctions for breaking the sanctions. Yeah, so we have heard about examples where the supply chain consisted of like 20 entities, and that makes the price of the final product to actually sometimes double or even more. It depends on the product and how the market works here. Yeah. So well, because we understand that the risk, the risk might charge 50%, might charge 100%. Yeah, it depends on the situation. It is not a free market. Yeah, it is a market of risky economy which make the things. Of course, it also made those supply chain networks which actually got an opportunity to earn money, yeah, and to make some like additional market. Of course, some of them are just people who just make money. Yeah, for example, it was one of the cases in Turkey. Some Turkish guy just owned a company, and his business is to resell the used CNC machines to Russia. And he openly actually says that, well, yeah, I did it before. Please do not mention that it is for military use. Just mention in the documents that it is for civilian use, and I will look for some used items on the market and will share it with you. But sometimes those people are just the networks of Russian secret services who are working as a part of the state mostly. Yeah, some of them are actually living in Europe or in the US. There were a bunch of arrests actually in the US when people were arrested, yeah, for smuggling the microelectronics. And in their internal letters, which they send between each other, they actually, on the holiday of Russian army, they sent each other messages like, a happy Russian Army Day. We are doing the best which we can to do to save our great Russia and homeland. Yeah. So it is not about business. It is about the work of the Russian state and Secret Service.
If it's possible, what are the countries that the Russians are using, in your understanding, the most to evade sanctions?
It is an interesting question because we have had this discussion now in terms of the new instrument of the EU, who, for the first time, the EU banned the export of all CNC machines to Kyrgyzstan. Yeah, so the EU, 27 member states, identified one state, Kyrgyzstan, yeah, and decided to ban the export of all CNC machines there because they ran out of all the diplomatic actions toward Kyrgyzstan, and the numbers which we have shows that it's like 500% more than the Kyrgyzstan actually needs, but they import the CNC machines, and it means that they just resell it to Russia. If we look at these numbers in money, so it's, if I am correct, the supply is about like $10 million, what is not a very vast amount of money. If we look at the supplies from China or Turkey, it would be hundreds of millions of dollars, or well, sometimes even billions. Yeah, the China trade with Russia, if we count like the Chinese also CNC machines, for example, it would be billions of dollars, because one CNC machine can cost like $500,000 just for one entity.
Roman, what is the are you saying CNC machine? What is that?
Yeah, so the machines which are using the special computers to make all the details on the plants. So they can be big as my room is, and they are the tools which are making the details on the plant. So they can make, I don't know, like a thing from metal or wood or plastic, both for civilian use and for the military use. And so when the EU bans the export of these machines to Kyrgyzstan, it is understandable because, Kyrgyzstan is not a big trade partner for the EU. Kyrgyzstan will not make such a big noise out of this case and will not have the impact of the instruments here on EU as China can have, for example. So here the discussion is, we know that China is the biggest supplier of both Western items and Chinese items to Russia. We know that Turkey is a big logistic hub of the supplies, and nevertheless, being a member of NATO, yeah, they still have this regional impact and would like to be like between all the such sensitive issues as like sanctions evasion. The question is what to do with this like next. Which instruments can we use to actually have the impact? It is easier maybe to have the discussions and negotiations with Kazakhstan, Georgia, or Armenia sometimes because, for example, EU might have more impact on them. And it is a very big question what to do with China concerning all the political issues which are now in the world. So that's the way to have a look at it.
Right.
If I can follow up, Glenn, we had mentioned wanting to do a show on Belarus, given recent reporting about Moscow pushing Belarus a little bit more to help them in their war in Ukraine. And there's been recent reporting about signal relay sites that they've allowed and then Belarus has stopped using. There's been discussions with the US of sanctions relief. How would you advise, given how close Belarus is to the battlefield, what's the right approach and utility of sanctions when it comes to Belarus?
The context is that the Belarus enterprises, of course, have the cooperations with Russia. Russia is the only friendly market for them, in their location. And the historic connections between enterprises of the military-industrial complex remained the same, so they do not change over the years. So the role of Belarus, and they have some of their enterprises which produces some of the semiconductors, if I'm not mistaken, and some of the machines, like the vehicles. So the role of Belarus and also the re-export from the EU, because here the role of Belarus is also that Belarus is not sanctioned as heavily as Russia by the EU, for example, which is the member of which has the border with Belarus, and that's why Russians also used that loopholes to get the items from the Belarus, which gets it from the EU. Now the EU is working out in each package, trying to make more of the bans against Belarus to close this like loopholes, but it was a case, and vice versa also. When Belarus, for example, like sells some of the wood from Russia, but making it as Belarus wood, and it's also a up so the sanctions evasion for Russia. So the role of Belarus as a Russian partner in this field, is pretty obvious. So here I think that the sanctions part should be a part of a more political discussion, of what is the strategy towards the Belarus, because the strategies can be different. One of the strategy was like not to sanction Lukashenko, for example, and in order to save the contacts, in order not to give him entirely towards Russia. And that was actually a strategy of Ukraine also, but it didn't help in 2022 when Russian troops went actually through the territory of Belarus to Russia, to Ukraine, which Ukraine will remember, and because it was an opportunity for Russian military troops to locate and have the attack against Kyiv, against the capital of Ukraine, because it is not far away from where now I'm sitting towards Belarus. It's like pretty close. So that was the strategy. What is going on now? Well, we can see how Lukashenko actually apologizes also for saying some words against Zelensky. So he continues to play this game, trying to show that he is not against Ukraine. He is ready for the negotiation. We can remember that Minsk negotiations, which were before full-scale invasion, were actually in Belarus, peace negotiation. So this role of Lukashenko, I think it is a political game which continues. Zelensky invited Tikhanovska, a couple of months in Kyiv, who is like elected president of the Belarus, also showing that Ukraine is ready to cooperate with different players in Belarus and to support actually the politician who was elected on the elections, showing signals that we also can meet with the Belarus. Of course, Ukraine doesn't need a pro-Russian Belarus on the border. That's obvious. Yeah, if Belarus might be able to be a more democratic society with elected president and democracy, which will not be into Russian ally, that I think is the biggest victory which might have. The question is how to get there.
Right. Let's talk about like oil and gas sanctions a little bit. Have you studied the sanctions packet that Lindsey Graham has been working on in Congress? My understanding is he has bipartisan support for a new round of sanctions against Moscow that he's been trying to get the President Trump, to sign. Recently, there was some indication that the president may be seriously thinking about this. What is your assessment of how it would impact the Russians if the U.S. enacts these new round of sanctions, this new round?
Yeah, so the idea to impose tariffs, like the secondary sanctions on buyers of Russian oil and gas, which is also one of the proposals, as far as I understand, in this package, and which was used by Trump in autumn last year. From my perspective, it is a good idea. It is a good instrument because it shows that the US is ready to counter Russia, not just directly, but also to fight for the allies, to fight for those countries who are not willing to make these sanctions happen on their own, like India, for example. And when Trump made that sanction against Russian oil companies in 2025, which was the first package of US, I think, in 2025, and told that like it would be tariffs for India, and China if they buy the oil from Russia. It was a great idea. It was a great opportunity to actually cut off some of the supplies, and cut off Russia from its biggest clients. The problem started with the enforcement, because if you impose sanctions and do not control whether anybody actually buys the oil, and do not impose secondary sanctions on those who buy it, then these sanctions are like just nothing. It is just a rhetoric, a symbol, how we talked about it before. So from our perspective, those sanctions which were into place in 2025 were more symbolic than the real impact. So here, with the new sanctions which the US might have, I think that the biggest question here is whether it is going to be a system of enforcement rather than one political decision, because the ideas like to impose tariffs on clients of Russian oil, they are great. The question is about the tariffs. And in terms of the US sanctions generally, it is a pity that US actually are not doing sanctions policy against the supply chains of the Russian military industrial complex as they did it before. Because that's what was I talking about when you play this game and you identify the suppliers of Russian military industrial complex. You sanction them all around the world. Everybody in the world knows that if you're going to supply some things like to Russia, which is a breach of sanctions, the US might sanction you and you will lose all the access to the financial system, to the global market, and maybe even being arrested somewhere even outside of the US if your role was pretty important. So this policy, how it worked before 2025, it was a pretty effective way how to do it. And the problem is, like the US stopped this job since 2025. So it would be interesting actually to see whether there are going to be any renewal of this global sanctions shield of the US. How I like wrote an op-ed in the Brussels Times where I mentioned that the EU is not just losing like the security shield of the US. It is also like losing the sanctions shield of the US, because EU is not ready for such active work as the OFAC or BIS did. The EU needs the consensus of 27 of members, and none of those members are ready to have this job done on their own. So it is now a question for the EU how to regain that scale which the US had before and which the EU also relied on.
This is a challenge that the US has, because you give the example of India and the tariffs. Right after President Trump announced that, and after his meetings with Modi, Prime Minister Modi, the Europeans signed what they call a historic, deal with India, trade deal. But they didn't mention anything about tariffs on Russian oil or gas. That upset many Americans because they asked the question, why are we doing this? And yet our European partners are leaving it out, right? And this is the debate that happens here in Washington, because the constituents of the policymakers, the elected officials, are saying, okay, why are we doing this? And yet our European partners are still doing business with, Russia. They're still doing business with China, buying stuff from China, which we don't want them to do. So it's very complicated. And, again, this sanctions packet that Lindsey Graham has, my understanding, it's quite robust. And I think the bipartisan support is there. The question is whether the president will sign it. And of course, he may be concerned about the impact on the U.S. economy, on gas prices. We saw that with the Iran war and how that impacted, which, by the way, my own assessment is it really didn't hurt the United States the way that many claimed it did economically. There was a great article.
The Iran war, Glenn?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a little bit painful, but when you look at what the Ukrainians are going through, like we talk about resilience, we could be a little bit more resilient, and we did not have to bend, the sanctions on the Iranians or the Russians, because we lifted on some of the stuff that was already out at sea. In my opinion, we didn't have to do that. Americans could survive a couple of months with higher gas prices. Now, it's easy for me to say that. I'm not living in the middle of the United States, but anyway, very complicated issue. And it's good to have people like you that study it and kind of really analyze it.
A quick word from our sponsor, CoverOn, and we'll get right back to the show. Glenn and I have spent our careers thinking about security. Between my time in the Army and CIA, protecting information and managing risk was basically the job. CoverOn is a digital identity protection service that combines scam detection, identity monitoring, and cyber insurance to help protect your money and recover from fraud if you become a victim. Given my background, I've been doxxed and targeted by some unsavory groups, to say the least, so I take my digital security very seriously. CoverOn watches the dark web for your personal information, which is great. It alerts you when your personal data, logins, or payment details are exposed, so you can do something, and it warns you early when something doesn't look right. Here's the part most tools don't cover that CoverOn does. CoverOn can help protect you financially in cases of identity theft recovery costs, if you lose money to scams or online fraud, or if you're targeted with cyber extortion or threats. And you can reach a real person for help, which I love. This is why I was interested in CoverOn. One scam can cost you everything. Use code RHPOD for up to 76% off at coveron.com/RHPOD. And now, back to the show.
Yeah, I would just give a remark, yeah. The EU, so when we are talking about the EU as one entity, that the US does something, the EU doesn't. Yeah, I think it is a mistake, because EU is an entity of 27 member states, and when the Orban regime, buys Russian oil, it is not the EU which actually buys Russian oil, and it was the case. Yeah, the Russian oil actually went to Orban and to Slovakia. And those are two countries, which have their vote, of course, and who, as we have seen, Orban's regime actually coordinated with Russia. His foreign minister tried to get out of the sanctions list some of the Russian oligarchs because Russian ministries asked him to do so. So that is the problem of the EU, that it is not a one entity, and that's why its foreign policy is divided into everything. So the point here, is that the US had its own goals when it did the sanctions work before. Like, the goal was to have the impact on Russia, actually, to make Russia weaker, and to have the impact on how Russia leads the war. if that is the goal, it doesn't matter what the EU does or not. Yeah, if it is the goal and the US has its own instruments how to have this impact, then the goal might be achieved just with the US instruments. But if it is not the goal, yeah, then we can have all these questions why we do and they do not. Now, the same example, for example, is in Ireland. The supplies, yeah, the work of Irish alumina factory, which is owned by Russian Rusal network, owned by Russian oligarch, yeah, and the EU does not impose the ban of export of alumina from Ireland to Russia because Ireland is not able to work and to find other markets for that entity because this plant provides a lot of the working places for people. Yeah, it is an important element of Ireland economy. And then the position of Ireland, why we should ban the export if we lose the working place of people. The problem is that alumina is then done into aluminium, and aluminium is a metal which has a various usage, yeah, in the military. And the reason why EU does not have this ban is because of position one country, Ireland, yeah, because their national interest is to save the jobs, and it doesn't important that their plant even have the signs on Russia in Ireland. So all of the signs of the plant are written in English, Irish, yeah, and Russia. So that is the example, yeah, how, and now it is a problem. They are trying to deal something with it on the EU level, yeah, but EU is not able just to say like close the factory and we're going to deal with those people who lose the jobs.
It's very hard to get real data as to what's happening in the Russian economy. I would just be curious of how you see their economy right now. Is it as weak as some people think?
Ukraine, for example, has a lot more problems with economy because it is smaller. Nevertheless, because of the support of partners, because of the support of the US, yeah, and other countries, Ukraine is able to have this war, yeah, since 2022 when half of the budget of Ukraine, yeah, is actually dependent on the allies. Well, I think that even if Russians have the same number of economic problems, they might have the same support from China, yeah, and maybe other of their allies. They are now starting to do it. For example, asking Kazakhstan, if I remember correctly, to supply the petroleum, yeah, to Russia because they have now the lack of it because of the attacks of the Ukrainian drones. So if we are interested into the state of Russian economy, of course it has problems. It has problems with banks. It has problems with the military production when the banks are actually obliged to give the loans to military factories. It doesn't depend on the market. It's just their task to support the military producers. Of course, the spending of war is growing, and it means that instead of building infrastructure, yeah, for their country, they spend millions of dollars of missiles, and they have to do it. Of course, these problems are there, but I do not think that it will collapse in this way just because of it. Yeah, so
it's disappointing.
What about, and let's maybe look at this a little bit differently. There's discussion that if the Russians actually come to the negotiations table and show a willingness to make an agreement which would be fair in the eyes of Kiev and abide by the terms of that agreement, then we need to talk about rolling back sanctions, reducing sanctions, which we see now the administration here talking about with Iran, reducing sanctions. And I'll be honest with you, I've dealt with this issue for many years from the U.S. side. And you said something. I don't know that the U.S. policy is to make Russia weak. I think the U.S. policy is to try and modify Russia's bad behavior. And that was why we put sanctions on Russia, to try and punish them and get them to behave differently. Now, it hasn't worked very well, but I think some people would argue that is why the U.S. has put sanctions on. So if you have a stick, you have to have a carrot. Are you guys in your think tank, are you analyzing what sanctions should be with reduced on Russia?
Lift, yeah.
Lifted. Thank you. On Russia, and what would the impact be on Ukraine? Because I think there will be an argument that if the Russians stop fighting and they stop bombing Ukraine like they're doing, and they show some willingness to make an agreement, we have to have some kind of carrot to reward them for the better behavior.
Yeah, sure. That is the nature of sanctions, that you impose them and then you leave them. Yeah, because sanctions are not for 40 years. Yeah, they shouldn't be for 40 years on. So yeah, for sure, that is the discussion which is going to be done if it is going to be the proper negotiation process. And we actually have seen a number of leaked documents. Yeah, the sanctions which Russians wanted to be lifted first. And one of the most important requests from them were the aviation part, yeah, oil, of course, and the supplies of oil and gas, and a number of assets, of course, the sovereign assets, and these discussions towards whether to seize them or not. If we analyze like the sanctions which are now imposed, from my perspective, the most important are the oil and gas sanctions because they provide Russia with money and with impact. Yeah, we can remember when Germany, how Germany was impacted by Russia because of the supplies of natural resources, energy resources, yeah, and how they impacted the politicians, the society, think tanks, businesses, etc. It's just an impact of soft power. They work the same way on Rosatom, yeah, with the nuclear energy, which was not sanctioned because of the impact which it has, and they had the same thing with oil. The EU was actually successful in cutting this like dependency generally on Russian energy resources, yeah, for the last years. And if it comes back, I think it would be a problem because it will just renew money, people, and soft power. So oil and gas, I think the most important one. The supply chains, yeah, of the technology, of the dual-use goods, of the military goods. Here we can also differentiate, of course. We can talk about purely military things, which, from my perspective, should not be lifted until Russia loses its military threats to Ukraine and EU. Yeah, here we can talk about dual-use goods, which are now pretty the same. This war has shown that actually the civilian drones can be scaled for a lot of the usage, and now drones are more important than artillery. Yeah, the FPV drones, the civilian one, which just get attached the grenade to and fly from like 10 kilometers. So the dual-use goods should be now at the same level of control as the military ones because it is important. The technologies in the cyber dimension, yeah, the EU has even a specific sanctions regime against Russia because of the hybrid and cyber attacks of Russia against EU. So the technologies which could be used by Russians for delivery and for the development of their cyber things should also be beyond, because that is the part of their actually capacities to pose the threat. So from my perspective, these things are the most important. If you're talking about, like the things as assets, travel bans, yeah, the trade in the items which have more civilian than military usage, yeah. So these things, I think, might be types of the negotiations because, like, yeah, sanctions are the things which would be lifted once, and yeah, these things like luxury, for example. I don't know what is the reason to ban the export of luxury cars to Russia. Maybe the idea in 2022 was that Russian oligarchs would be so deprived without luxury cars that they stop the war. But I think it's just like it is not a very effective way. They still get those Mercedes from Georgia, and nobody cares because, well, actually the impact here is not very big from my perspective. So yeah, sure, we shouldn't be afraid of these discussions we should be prepared for it in order to make them more effective with the differentiations, what is more like a priority in a strategic perspective, and what is less.
So interesting. Yeah, great question on that one, Glenn. My last question, Roman, I can't even believe how fast this went, and we could ask you questions for hours. Thank you for taking this time. Specifically over the next 6 months, you just talked about potential sanctions that could be lifted. And it's widely reported that there are different gaps. You mentioned the supply chain when it comes to imposing sanctions. If you could orient the US, the EU, the UK, and others on a specific part of the supply chain or a part of the sanctions network that needs to be covered in the next 4 to 6 months, what do you think is most important to orient those sanction packages on?
I wanted here quickly to add about lifting of sanctions because I didn't cover it. So the point of lifting is a point of conditions. So I do not see that now Russia is actually ready to stop the war, and we shouldn't be trapped here in the situation when Russia just taking its time and making us thinking about sanctions lifting, but not actually doing any steps to stop the war. So here, when I said that we shouldn't be afraid of this discussion, another condition is that this discussion should start with real steps from Russian part and real negotiations, which we should also somehow to see that it is worth it. But coming back to the specific recommendation. So as we are more focused on the supply chains, I would recommend the specific things in this field. However, I support the recommendations, for example, to ban the moves of Russian shadow fleet in Baltic Sea, for example, in Black Sea, in the Mediterranean Sea. So those seas where actually NATO countries can use their fleet to physically stop Russian shadow fleet to move. I think these recommendations are pretty solid and would have a real impact on the Russian economy, but from the supply chains perspective. So the first thing is to pay more focus to strategic minerals. And a specific recommendation is to add the strategic minerals to the common high priority items list, which was created by G7 countries, EU, US, as a list of more critical items which Russia needs for their military. It doesn't contain any strategic minerals. However, we have analyzed now the Russian dependency on the minerals which they need for the military perspective, because despite being a huge land, Russia is not able to develop their deposits which they need. They have to invest money and time, sometimes to build new cities around these deposits of the minerals in order to make them in condition to actually have the product. That's why they now have this goal to work on this dependency until 2030. And from our perspective, it is important actually to focus on where they get the strategic minerals and the technology for developing their own deposits, and actually to make more focus on that. Because supplies are going not just from China. Some molybdenum, tantalum, uranium, other minerals are going to Russia from Armenia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. So actually those countries which might be in the more diplomacy and economic dialogue with sanctions coalition, and I don't know, maybe Trump's family would like to buy some of those deposits, for example, for the US and use those minerals for the economy of US. It might be the way out. Why not? The second thing is to actually make businesses check their compliance system of their clients. And here I'm talking, it might be at the level of the EU, for example, or the member states or the US. So the compliance is a pretty difficult way. But what we now understand that businesses usually, if they have a good compliance, they check their client. But the task to check the compliance system of your client so that the client is the same compliance as you and do not re-export your sensitive item further, that is a task which might need more resources into. And here also the audits of the end users, and use of the items, which can be done. The problem is that for this, you would also need more resources, for this task. And the third thing, that's what I like, a more political one. How I told you, the sanctions need more scale in the supply chain field, and this scale of the sanctioning and the usage of secondary sanctions, that was now a lack of after the US stopped to do this work on a big scale. So here, I think that we also need a player who would be able to scale the work, not afraid of the secondary sanctions, and to have this actually political will to have the impact on Russia. That might be
Thank you.
the three recommendations here.
Glenn, why don't you round us out?
Nope. Just want to say thank you, Roman, for your time, for sharing all this really interesting and valuable insight with our viewers, our audience. Ryan, thank you. I want to wish you luck in the heat. Stay hydrated, like I said yesterday.
That's right. That's right.
And hopefully we can maybe do an update in a couple of months on where we're at with the sanctions. One we didn't really talk about today, but I'd like to talk about the future is China, like how the Ukrainians are, because the Chinese are a problem here because they're doing a lot to help the Russians and some of the other countries that are also being used as middlemen in the process. But we'll put that off for our next engagement. Everyone, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Roman.
Yeah, thank you for the talk.
Thanks for listening and being a part of the RH community. Would you like to receive the same daily intel brief that Glenn and I read? You can get it at restrictedhandling.com. We've curated what we consider to be the most relevant and reputable sources on all things international security, geopolitics, military and intel ops, and economics and sanctions, focused exclusively on Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and the Middle East, to include accompanying podcasts for Russia, China, economics, and spy stories. Just head to restrictedhandling.com, enter your email, and you'll get the daily briefs that Glenn and I both read, and you can leave comments and questions that we can respond to. Thanks again for listening. Stay safe.